Good morning, gentlemen. I'm first of all going to talk to you about what you see on the map. That is the map of the Russian Empire, which used to be there when the Tsar used to rule over Russia. This map, which you have seen, was of 1907, but everything changed in 1917 when the Communist Party came over. And very soon, by 1992, that monolith map which you have seen broke into 22 countries. That means the effect of communism was the breakup of the Tsarist Empire. I think so. People who really talk that communism is a good thing should understand that communism is not a good thing, and that is the worst of it. And the fact is, communism, despite controlling the whole of Eastern Europe, as you can see from the map, from 1949 to 89, when the USSR was there as a monolith entity, really led Russia to its doom. It's a sad story, but the fact remains that we must understand the nature of communism, which basically means negating the rights of the people and killing the people who were ruling them earlier, like Tsar Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia when he and his family were executed in Siberia on the orders of Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, who was the henchman of Vladimir Lenin. See, at one time, Lenin was a greatly respected leader in Russia, but not very many people remember him now, and neither they want to think about this man. Trotsky, of course, was a brutal man, and he believed in the policy of dog eats dog, and he had to run away from Russia once Stalin took over. And once Stalin took over, Trotsky ran away to Netherlands, then he went to Turkey, and then finally he ended up in Mexico, where he was in hiding there till Stalin sent a killer to kill him. So Trotsky had to atone for his sins. But the fact remains, if Trotsky had remained in Russia and had come into power, he would have killed Stalin himself. So, gentlemen, this is the facts of history, the failure of communism and the failure of the USSR. The USSR at one time had everything going for them, and if you see the photograph of 1919, you can see Red Square where the Russian Soviet Republic was formed, and Lenin is standing and shouting with joy. But the same photograph in 23 shows that they've forgotten about the Russian Revolution and Lenin. And Russia is now a more pragmatic state, though I won't say it's an ideal state, because we have Vladimir Putin as the president, but he's more of a pseudo-dictator, and you can't call him a democrat. I mean, he's got a lot of his opponents, I think, sent to the gallows. Nothing is proved so far, because he's the president of Russia. And what I say, of course, is just a conjecture. I got no specific proof about it. But I have proved that he's going to be president for life. Unlike the Americans, where you have a president for a maximum of 2 years, 2 terms, and that's about it. You can't come back again. Well, gentlemen, there was a time when the Russian Empire and the Tsar was ruling half the world. But I will say one thing, that the Tsarist Empire basically in the per capita income was very poor. It was a laggard. Russia was known as the laggard of the world. That is why, though they produced some very great rulers like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, and then there was, of course, that terrible chap, Ivan the Terrible, but all these people basically did do one thing, and that is they brought about the glory of Russia. They talked about the glory of Russia. But Lenin, who came in, had a different view. He had been an intellectual who had been hiding in Switzerland for a long time. Then he came to Germany, and once the revolution took over, he came in and became the leader. And initially there was a moderate who came into power that was known as by the name of the Kerensky, who was ready to have the Tsar continue. And I think that would have been a good thing. He was a centrist. But Lenin ousted him, and Kerensky finally ran away to America. He died in New York. It's a sad occurrence. And the Russian state also died. I would say died. That would be the proper word. It broke up into all but 20 odd countries, and countries which have been part of the Soviet Union for over 100 years of the Russian Empire, or even 200 years, like Finland and Poland, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, all went their way. So, gentlemen, it's a lesson for people in history that nationalism is very, very important. And also, it's a lesson that when you are in power, you have to keep all the nationalities with you. And India needs to have a lesson on this. You can't have one sort of language like Hindi just floating around all over the country and saying, well, the Sangh Brotherhood saying we have only Hindi. It's not possible. So that's just one of the, what you call, pinpricks which is in the Indian state. And we would take action because India is a multi-faith company, multi-religious company, and you have a sizable minority of Muslims here, about 20% of them. And they are definitely, I can tell definitely, they are not loyal to the country. But then you've got to take them forward. How are you going to take them forward? You have to integrate them with laws, but if you keep pampering them with different laws, things will work in a different way. And one thing we must be very clear, the Russian state collapsed, basically the USSR collapsed because throughout history of the world, rather the history of Russia, Russia for the last 1,000 years never was a democracy. They didn't believe in democracy at all. That's something alien to them. They were always autocrats. Look at Peter, Ivan, Nicholas. They were all autocrats. And when Lenin came into power, he was the biggest autocrat. He was the first man who set up the concentration camps where the opponents were herded together and taken to distant places like in Siberia, made to spend their life there, toil morning 6 to evening 6, given a bread of slice or a soup to drink, and then finally they died there. I mean, the concentration camp is something which is an invention of the USSR. I don't know what's still going on, because I think even Subhash Bose was put in one of these concentration camps because Stalin felt he was an ally of the Germans, and he hated the Germans, the Nazis. Well, all that is part of history, you can't deny it, but the fact remains that under Stalin, Russia did progress. I won't say didn't make progress, but that was when there was an authoritative regime round. And that authoritative regime got so many of the Russian civil minorities together, the various linguistic, the maps which I've shown you. There were the Zakuts, the Armenians, there were so many, all of them, the Cossacks, all of them were put under one under one blow by Stalin, and he kept them together on the leash. That was the only way you could have kept the USSR going, and that is by an iron fist. But that fist didn't come, and finally a man came there that his name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Now this man, I don't know what to make of this man. I mean, I think he presided over the liquidation of the Russian Empire. I remember once Winston Churchill, I was reading the history of England, and I found that Churchill, when he became Prime Minister, was asked about the independence of India. And his answer was very simple. He said, I have not become the first minister of the King's cabinet to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. So that should have been the motto of Gorbachev, but I think he started something called glasnost, that is freedom. And he thought that freedom is going to be very good for Russia. Or maybe, I don't know, because what was his thinking? I mean, maybe he'd been brainwashed or whatever it may be. But the fact is, he brought in some amount of freedom, but then he unleashed forces which the Russians could not control, which Stalin could control. Stalin controlled with the iron hand, his policy of collectivization of agriculture, collectivization of industry, and all that he put together with force. And the Russian state did prosper under him. That is, he did away with personal freedom. But the Russian economy rose, and though Russia never really came up to the standard of America or the French or the British, but Russia definitely went much ahead of what was there during the Tsarist regime. So what point is that authoritarianism has its benefits, and Stalin was that, and when Gorbachev came, he brought in a different whim, and the Russian state, not used to the freedom to do anything, just withered away. And this is what is the lesson for India also. If you're going to give too much of freedom to the states, we have Mamta Banerjee, having a ball saying, being she's the Empress of Bengal, doing what she likes, doesn't want the central laws to be made applicable. And then you have got in Tamil Nadu secessionist tendencies with Stalin, the chief minister, and then you have the caste divide, which is even being sponsored by Rahul Gandhi. Why even the Modi is talking of caste system? Now he wants to have a caste census. So all these leaders are realizing, taking any lesson from Russia, that once you are going to give recognition to such ethnic groups, like in the caste system, you are digging your grave, and the nemesis of India, that is, India is going to break up, and will break up if this does not stopped. Rahul Gandhi has the axe to grind, axe to grind in the sense he's out of power, he doesn't know what the hell to do. So he's looking at straws, something caste system, then he looks something else, then he starts attacking Adani. I mean, it's like a man, like a bull in a china shop, he doesn't know what the hell to do. So he keeps running here and running there, and somebody cages him, and then he probably keeps silent. And then the Modi, unfortunately, I could have done better, But after the last time when he won just 240 seats in Parliament, I think it was a bit of a shock to him. And if he continues in this way, sponsoring more and more to the extremists, then he's going to be in trouble. His biggest failure as Modi's failure has been these farm laws. They're very progressive laws. And despite that, once there were agitation by the rich farmers, mind you, the rich farmers, the Punjabi just caved in like a pack of cards and then came out with some silly statement. Then also you must remember that at that time when Russia went into the war against Nazi Germany, they had a man with iron will, and this man was Joseph Stalin. So Stalin held the Russian people together for the great patriotic war, they call it, but definitely they won that war and they saved the world. Just imagine if the Russian army had not been fighting on behalf of the West, Hitler would have overrun England, and maybe even the United States would have a very tough time, and he had a strong ally in Japan. So gentlemen, this is the crux of the issue. And now I have to mention something about the Afghans. The Afghans have been a very independent force all the time. And one of the reasons was, I think in 1979, when Leonid Brezhnev was the president, he decided the time had come to intervene in Afghanistan. It was the most serious decision, because the Soviet army was not trained to fight in the mountains. They didn't know what the hell to do. And the net result of all that was happening was that they were bogged down. And of course they were very brutal. They killed a lot of Afghans, and they didn't have evaluate that the Americans would come on the side of the Afghans and made it into a religious war. So it was Pakistan and America who really started the religious war, and they were the ones who brought in the Mujahideen and the Taliban. They're the ones who created the Mujahideen and the Taliban. And net result of that was that this combined force could defeat the Soviet Union. And in the meanwhile, they ruptured the Soviet economy so badly that even, I'm told, essential items were not available in Russia in 1989, when at that time Gorbachev had become the president. Of course, Brezhnev had passed away. If Brezhnev had lived, or one of his successors like Sharenko had been alive, maybe the breakup of the Soviet Union could have been stopped, and there could have been a course correction done. But there was nobody to do the course correction, like Deng did in China. He changed the rigid economy of the Communist Party and made it a market-oriented economy, and brought in fresh capital. Billions of dollars came from America, and China moved ahead. Such a thing didn't happen in Russia. The Russians were a closed society, and they were backward. Despite all the efforts of Stalin, they remained backward. Of course, they did make some progress in making the military aircraft and the planes, and they launched the Sputnik. They had their space missions and all that. and technology was at a high level, but nothing went down to the people because the personal freedom of the people was completely finished. And that is something we must remember also. When you give too much of freedom to somebody, it's bad. But when you give too much of leeway, independence to a person, also it is bad. It leads to fiscalist tendencies. And Russia, as it is, was always going to collapse because of the various ethnic uh, clans and sects which are operating in Russia, the various religious groups. Russia had a big Muslim minority, and the Russian population at one stage was getting scared that they would be in a minority. At the same time, the Russians were very ruthless. So was Stalin. And I'll tell you about that incident in 1933-34 when there was a famine. I've just shown you a photograph of that. In Ukraine, I think 2 to 10 million people died of hunger. And Winston Churchill, I think in 41 or 42, maybe I think it was beginning of 43, had visited Moscow, and he and Stalin got along well together. They drank the whole night, and Churchill asked Stalin, "Look, in the Ukraine, 2 to 3 million people died of hunger. Don't you think that was a reflection of the communist state?" And what was Stalin's reply? His reply was, "Even if 10 million people had died, I would prefer they die because they were revisionists and they were worse than the Nazi regime. And the killing of these people is a historical necessity." So just imagine the thinking of the man, that he wouldn't mind losing 10 million people so that the purity of the Russian Revolution could be maintained, and he didn't think that the Nazi party is that much of a terror compared to this. So if in that sort of a scenario, when freedom was given by Gorbachev, it was like, the volcano erupting. The small ethnic minorities decided they didn't want to stay with Russia. The Armenians, the Cossacks, the Azerbaijan Muslims, the Kazakhs, the Poles, the Ukrainians, all of them broke from the motherland. And Russia, which had a population of 325 or 330 million at that time, was reduced to 145 million. So Russia was halved population-wise, not by area-wise. The area still, Russia is the biggest country in the world, but the biggest has got no relevance when you don't have the population to sustain it. And then the Russians had lost so many men in battle during Second World War that the male-female ratio had gone up. What actually happened was, during 1989, when Gorbachev came into power, he probably just went to sleep like Rip Van Winkle. You know who was Rip Van Winkle? Rip Van Winkle was a man who had gone to a village to hunt deer and elk, and there he fell asleep, and when he woke up, 20 years elapsed. That's what happened. The Russians went to sleep in 87, and by 92, 20 years had elapsed. They'd become totally discredited. Their industry was rusted. Their agriculture production had gone down because there's no collectivization, no ownership of land. People couldn't do anything, and net result was the Russian state was heading for collapse. This is what really happened. And if you look at it, it's a historical necessity, I think, that the Russian state had to collapse, and so did communism collapse. I think China is not a communist country at all now. The only, I think, country which I can think of which is a communist is Cuba. And look at the way the poor Cubans are being treated. They've got hunger, they've got no electricity, and they are just living hand to mouth. And yet, the president of Cuba thinking he's a great gun, going around here and there, I think it would be in the interest of the world if such a regime is removed. And then also we have religious bigotry. In America, Russia, this is one thing which got them down. The Muslims never integrated with the Russians. You see, they were the people, like in Chechen. They were fighting the Russian state. Muslims who wanted only independence and nothing else. Independence from what? I don't. They can't define anything. Look at the way they destroyed their own population in Iran. So it's the Russian Muslims, the big Muslim countries all broke away from Russia. And Russia, which was a multi-ethnic country, suddenly became just a Russian white state. Even now there are a lot of Muslims and they have been fighting and so many terrorist acts in Moscow. Gentlemen, we are coming to the end of my video. I hope you like what I've said. I will say goodbye and God bless. Whatever happened in Russia is something which had to happen. And that's about all I'll say. Goodbye, God bless, and Jai Hind.